Well, it's good to be with you today. This is an exciting day. We're in week 2 of our series of the Winsome Church. And what we're going to be doing in this series is continue to unpack and frame what is biblical hospitality. And what does it mean for our church to be oriented towards those who are on the outside and bringing them in to the family of God. There's this great book that came out not too long ago that was on New York Times bestseller called Unreasonable Hospitality by a guy named Will Guidara. And he ran a restaurant called 11 Madison Park. It's a very, very fancy restaurant in New York, the kind of place where the servers are in suits and ties and the tablecloths are all crisp and perfect, and they serve 10, 15-course meals. It's the real dining experience. In fact, in his book, he talks about when he sold it at the beginning of 2020, it was ranked the #1 restaurant in the world. You can imagine the whole operation, right? You got 30 cooks in the kitchen. You've got these 10 to 15 course tasting menus. It was quite extravagant. And he tells this story that really illustrates the kind of the thesis of his book. And that was the reason they were so successful. The reason that they reached such great heights as a restaurant was not because their food was great, and their food was great. It wasn't just because the inside of their lobby looked beautiful and everything they did was perfect to the nines. So that's all true. But the reason we were so successful was because we showed unreasonable hospitality. And he illustrates it great with this little story he tells where they were a really busy day. It was during lunchtime. And he ended up in the dining room trying to help bus tables because it was so busy. And he went to one table where there were these 4 guys sitting around talking about their food tour. They were foodies. They were food reviewers, if you will. And they had visited all the best spots in New York. And they said, the one regret, one of the men said, was that we never tried a New York hot dog. Immediately, a little light bulb went off in Will's mind. He didn't say anything. He simply grabbed their plates and took it back to the kitchen. And then he ran outside the door to the local hot dog stand, grabbed a hot dog, brought it back into the kitchen, and presented it to their head chef, to which the head chef said, absolutely not. We are not serving this here. This is not going to happen. But Will said, trust me, I got this. Can you please make this look presentable? And, in New York, the chefs would often refer to them as dirty water dogs or some funny phrase like that, because it just kind of had a reputation of not being, up to standard. So the chef took the hot dog, and cut it into 4 pieces, plated it very nicely, added a swath of ketchup and mustard and relish, and made it look presentable. And he ended up taking it to the table, bringing it to the table, and I want to read to you from his book. He said, to make sure you don't go home with any culinary regrets, here you are, a New York City hot dog. And he set it on the table, and he said the table freaked out. They were so excited. They could not believe it. And he said this, he wrote this in his book. At that point in my career, I had served thousands and thousands of dishes and many thousands and thousands of dollars worth of food. And I can confidently say that no one has ever reacted in the way to anything I've served them better than they reacted to a hot dog. He goes on to write, I've been so focused on excellence, on all the details and making a meal great, but somehow I hadn't realized something that was really important. That in restaurants, our reason for being is to make people feel seen, to make them feel welcome, and to give them a sense of belonging. You see, I think that's what the Winsome Church is really all about. It's about making people on the outside feel seen, like they belong, like they're part of this family even though they haven't even experienced it yet. And so as we do that today, what I want to do is sort of unpack this framework for biblical hospitality even deeper than we did last week. You see, I think the individualistic society in the West that we live in, often it affects us more than we seem to realize it. We become more focused on protecting our property and making sure that we have what we need, but oftentimes we forget about this call to welcome the stranger. In fact, I remember the other day I was in my house and the doorbell rang. And I thought to myself, this wave of anxiety came over me, like, who's at my door? And I thought, why do I feel that? Where does that come from? What's forming me in a way that makes me think it's because someone came to my door in the middle of the day that I should be concerned? Right? There's this sort of innate sense that many of us have to want to build fences around our homes, to protect everything we own, and to not have a natural posture of welcome to those on the outside. I'm going to read this from Henry Nouwen. He said, in a world full of strangers, estranged from their own past, culture, and country, from their neighbors, friends, and family, from their deepest self and their God. We witness a painful search for the hospitable place where life can be lived without fear and where community can be found. Our society seems to be increasingly full of fearful, defensive, aggressive people, anxiously clinging to their property and inclined to look at their surrounding world with suspicion, always expecting an enemy to suddenly appear, intrude, and do harm. But still, that is our vocation, to convert the enemy into a guest and to create the fear and fearless space where brotherhood and sisterhood can be formed and fully experienced. To see the outsider, or the enemy, as now one puts it, as a guest. And so let's take a minute here to take this passage. We're going to go verse by verse because there's a lot in here. And I intentionally wanted Wayne to read the whole thing because we're going to break down what the writer of Hebrews is trying to communicate. He starts in verses 3, 4, and 5 by saying, "Continue to remember those in prison, as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you were suffering. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for the God will judge the adulterer and the sexually immoral. Keep your lives free of money and be content with what you have, because God has said." Now, it's interesting that it starts by this idea of as you're in prison, as you're with people in prison, this sort of posture of hospitality, and then all of a sudden starts talking about money and sexuality. That's kind of a strange thing, but there's a principle here. And that's because of the influence, I think, that many of us experience, because of our experience in Western culture, we naturally come to the conclusion that the rights and the happiness of the individual take precedent over all other things. In fact, even over the other person. But the gospel of Jesus says something different. And it says something different specifically about our money and about our sexuality. Because the gospel tells us, and we read in the scriptures, that there is a certain way in which we are to frame how we think about those things. They belong to who? To God. Our wealth, this beautiful building we're in right now, our homes, all of that is a gift from God. And because it belongs to God, it is not just ours to hoard and to do whatever we want, but we are called to live in a different way in the world. In the same way with our sexuality. It's not merely for our pleasure. In fact, our sexuality is meant for us to procreate, in order for us to build communities, to live in a way, and not just an individualistic, specific, and hyper-focused on ourselves way, but to look outward for the sake of others. And so because of this cultural pull, what do? We build fences around our homes. We have phone apps you can download so you can have groceries delivered to your house. You don't have to see another human. In fact, I was in Northwest Arkansas not too long ago with one of my cousins, one of Betsy's cousins, and it's Walmart land over there, and they ordered Walmart to order via drone, which was kind of cool, honestly. We went outside and we all sat and watched like it was like a big entertainment show, right? As the drone slowly delivered it. Unfortunately, the ice cream all melted by the time it got to the house. But it was a pretty cool thing. And it's all our kids wanted to do was order stuff from drones. We are living in the future. What do? We sometimes, instead of having people in our homes, we'll order Uber Eats or DoorDash. Instead of cooking, what's easy, what's fast, what can be done in the privacy of our own home, rather than opening the doors and welcoming people around the table. This cultural pull is why showing hospitality can feel like we're swimming upstream. It can feel like we are doing something that is counter to what is pulling us in. And so the question that I would have us wrestle with this morning, because we all live in the same culture, are we going to be more affected by Western culture, or are we going to be more affected by the gospel of Jesus? Now, the gospel of Jesus at times is going to confront us. It's going to challenge us. It's going to push us out of our comfort zones. But sometimes it's in that space where God can form us most deeply. Now, let's go back to the text. If we go back, it says, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Or another translation says, "thereby having entertained angels unaware." You've heard that line before. The word entertained in the Greek, this idea of hospitality, is philoxenia, which is love of the neighbor. Okay, you have the Greek word phileo, which is kind of this familial love, this love you have for a person who's in your family. And then you have the word xenia, which you may have heard the word xenophobia, right? That's a fear of the stranger. But philoxenia is the opposite, is the love and welcome of a stranger so much that you're actually entertaining them as a guest. And so philoxenia is to love people who are different than you and bringing them home as a guest. This reference to entertaining angels unaware actually brings us back to Genesis. Genesis 18, if you know the story, Abraham had 3 guests in his home and was feeding them. And he was unaware at the time that he was entertaining God's angel messengers. Right? But there's greater implications here. That when we extend hospitality, when we go outside of our way to care and love the stranger and those on the outside and bring them in, it's possible, according to this text, that we might be entertaining angels unaware. You see, in ancient times, hospitality had a very high value. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because then travel looked a lot different. You may be walking by foot, maybe even without shoes. This is why they practice foot washing, because you're walking really long distances. There are no hotels that you can get online and book, right? So you had to rely on the kindness of a stranger who would take you into their home and feed you and give you a bed to sleep on. So that was a big deal. So there was a much higher value on hospitality. In fact, there's something called the Hospitality Code, which had 4 parts to it. There's the invitation, the screening, the provision, and the departure. And just giving a little context, let me break this down real quick. The invitation, if you were traveling to the gate of a town, you would wait for someone to invite you inside the city to stay with them. You can see this all over the scriptures in Genesis 19 and Genesis 24. In Acts, when Paul comes to Philippi, right, you come outside the city and you wait for the invitation. Then there's a screening, and this was to make sure that you weren't coming into the city to terrorize the city. You weren't an enemy coming in to hurt people. And so they would ask a series of questions to do a little bit of a screening. The provision, if you were the host, it was your job to wash that person's feet. That was a normal practice. That'd be really uncomfortable in our culture, but that was a normal practice in order to make someone feel welcomed and at home. And then lastly, there's departure. Typically, you would leave the next day, but there was a rule that you would not stay more than 2 nights. Okay, the guest's job was to get out of there after 2 nights. Even said, though, there is a high value and an expectation of hospitality. But what's interesting is that when God made his covenant with Israel in Mount Sinai, he began to explain the kind of community that he wanted them to be. And the practice of hospitality was taken from this is an expected thing, to ratcheting it up to something far greater and a far greater scope of what was expected of the people of God. See, hospitality to the Jews was beyond anything else in any other culture. Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 19 sort of frames this out. It says, "For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality, accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt." And so I think there are a couple ways where this goes above and beyond. One, in ancient cultures, there are values of expediency. So again, the 2-day max rule, right? You were to stay for 2 days. But God says, I'm going to give you a whole new understanding and basis for this. He says that you were once wanderers in Egypt, right? You were once exiled. You were once on the outside, and it was a lot longer than 2 days, right? You were there, you were gone, you were out in the world, and I brought you home. I brought you to your new home. My salvation for you was my hospitality towards you, and you have been saved by my grace of this life-giving hospitality that ultimately brought you to home. Because you were strangers and aliens once, that was you. Now you go and live likewise. That's who you were. I brought you in. Now you go and do the same. And then the second way is he blows the scope out of it another way. What does he do? He says hospitable means taking care of who? The orphan, the widow. You're poor and care for strangers and foreigners, right? Talking about immigrants, refugees, people who were from other lands, who had no longer had a home, who came searching for safety. And he said, you, the people of God, are to welcome people into your community. And so what that means is for those of us who are blessed, who have wealth and a home and shelter and have means to be able to care for those who need it. We were once like those people who were wandering. God brought us in, and we need to also, in that way, extend love for those who are on the outside. I remember a few years ago at my former church, we welcomed a group of Congolese refugees into our community, and it was really crazy how it all came to be. There was a war going on in the Congo, and many of the refugees were fleeing the country out of just safety for their lives, ended up being displaced, and ended up in Wichita, Kansas, of all places. And there was a pastor among them who had a community of these Congolese refugees, and he said, we need a place to worship. And so we had a separate building on our campus where our students met. And so we offered them our building for them to worship and have a place to gather on Sundays. The Spirit of God was moving in our congregation in a way, in our leadership, that at one point they asked the question, it's great that we host them, and that's awesome. But shouldn't we at some point invite them into what we're doing? Shouldn't we have them be a part of our worship experience? And so they had a special combined Sunday, and it was an absolute train wreck. It was awesome, but there were so many things different about their culture and our culture. So for example, they had a choir and their own music, and they were musicians. They could sing. But their worship service wasn't a clean hour long. It was, we're going to sing until we can't sing anymore. And so imagine a Presbyterian, one service, got to be out by football, like this is the Chiefs are playing, like you got to do this. It went on and on and on. It's 2 o'clock, 2:30, and people were really getting anxious. Not only that, but they were not used to the customs of living in America. They didn't understand how our toilets worked or toilet paper. And so there were toilets that were overflowing and flooding and sewage flooding into the hallways. It was a crazy, crazy Sunday. You might even say it was messy, right? That said, I think that was a picture of showing how what radical hospitality towards an outsider makes, if you think about it from their perspective, like they are coming into a strange land where they don't understand anything in the customs, and to be welcomed in and appreciated and seen for who they are meant the world to them. But I also think it formed that community. To be able to have that posture. Now, not everybody was happy about it. There were those who were frustrated. But I think at large, the Lord did something really powerful through it. We are called to be a people of welcome. Welcoming people who aren't like us, who don't talk like us, think like us, people who may not have anything to give, right? It's not about what you can receive out of it. It's about being that posture of welcome for the fact that's who we're called to be as Christians. It's not always convenient. It's not always clean. It's not always efficient or reciprocal, not always comfortable, and it's definitely not always safe. But yet, this is the kind of countercultural way that God has called us to be as a people. Because we were once outsiders and God brought us in, he's calling us to bring those who are on the outside and welcome them. I don't know about you, but I feel challenged by that. I'm not preaching here from a place of I've figured this out. I'm preaching from a place of this is convicting for me. If you go back to the text, it says, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality without knowing it. I want to return to something I talked about last week, and that's this element of the sacramental quality of hospitality. Okay, what is a sacrament? We have baptism. We have the Lord's Supper, communion. What are the elements? You have water, bread, and wine. These are common, everyday things that all of us need to live. And yet, when we bring those together for the sacrament of baptism or communion, we're taking something ordinary and common and allowing it to be a conduit of God's power in our life. And in the same way, I believe hospitality is how God can work powerfully in the life of others, in ordinary ways, in opening our homes, gathering around tables, looking people in the eye so they feel seen and known. Through that, God can work powerfully. It's not about performance, right? It's not about having everything perfect. It's not about having the proper serving utensils. I mean, those things matter and they're good, but it's not the point. And so I want to stir this in, again, in a practical way. As you think about your life, as you think about the people God's placed in your life, who in your life needs a kind of reach out or a gesture of hospitality towards them, who are walking in a season of loneliness, who are maybe new to a new place, and they don't feel like they quite fit in their world. Who might that be for you? If you show radical hospitality over the years, you don't know how the conversations, the time spent over meals, time spent meeting people for coffee, all the ways in which we can show hospitality, you don't know how that might lead someone closer to Jesus. And you might actually be entertaining angels unaware. God can work through your hospitality. So what can we do? For us, how can we be people who show hospitality? And why can we be people who show hospitality? You see, in the passage, look in verse 5, it says, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. The reason we can be free is because God's love for us and his hospitality towards us frees us to be hospitable to other people. Tells us in verse 11, so Jesus suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. And so when Jesus died on the cross, it was the opposite of what it meant to experience hospitality, right? He was crucified, tortured, put on a cross. He was outside the city gate, and yet hospitality takes the weary stranger in. Jesus was inside, thrown out, and then killed. See, this takes us back to the beginning, right? The Garden of Eden. When we were home, a place without death or parting. Home is a place where you're loved, where you belong. In the Garden of Eden, there's no decay, no disease, no death. It's home. But in the fall, there's this home no longer exists in the way that it once was. All of us, on some degree, are exiled, right? We are on the outside because of sin, entering into the equation. And the reality is, all homes and places change. People pass away. Things change. Life moves on. We are all cold and weary travelers to some degree who have turned from God, and it is the sin in our life that drives us towards hoarding our resources, wanting to hold on and grasp onto that home. But remember Jesus, casted outside the gate, killed on a cross, the same person who was born in a feeding trough. This is why he says, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And when he says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? We get from our text in verse 5, never, never will I forsake you. Never will I forsake you. It's because God has taken the place of exile that we deserved on the cross, the opposite of hospitality, so that we on the outside can be brought into the family of God. You see, it's through Jesus' radical act of love for us that we then can turn and show radical love to the world. And when we get that from our head to our heart, when we really understand it, it'll transform us to be the kind of people who can show radical hospitality with nothing to gain but the fact that this is what we're called to do. I think Paul says it perfectly in Ephesians 2:12-19. Remember that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenant of the promise, without hope and without God in the world, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have now been brought near by the blood of Christ. He was made homeless so that you could be brought home. And lastly, the future in verse 14. For we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. That's the city we read about in Revelation 21, this future city when Jesus returns and we will live forever with him. Friends, in the future, God's going to open up the gates of our real, true home. But in the meantime, we're called to be people who are bringing in people into the family of God. Not too long ago, I watched this documentary. And it was a story kind of tracing the people who lived in the French village of Les Chambon. And the villages were surrounded, a surrounding plateau provided refuge for 5,000 Jews who were fleeing to Nazi Germany in 1940 to 1944. And led by the local pastors of the Reformed Church in France, the residents of these villages offered shelter, private homes, and safety to these traveling people. These people were fleeing for their lives. And this town rallied around them and cared for them in a powerful, powerful way. In this documentary, I came across a couple lines that really, really moved me. And so I want to show you this quick, it's about a 2-minute clip, and just see the heart of the people of this village. Let's watch that now.
Here on this plateau, at one time or another, in the course of 4 long years, some 5,000 Jews found shelter among some 5,000 Christians.
On ne demandait pas d'explications. Personne ne demandait rien. Les gens qui venaient sur le point leur rendre service.
Mais vous saviez que vous couriez quand même quelques risques à abriter des juifs.
Je sais pas si... Au début, pas tellement. Et puis, vers la fin, bien sûr, ça commençait bien
à devenir dangereux.
dangereux, mais enfin.
Mais vous les avez gardés quand même.
Ah oui.
Pourquoi?
Je sais pas.
Elle
J'estimais
était
ça.
habituée.
On ne comprend pas qu'on fasse tant d'histoires autour. Ça s'est fait tout simplement. Moi, j'en avais pas tellement. J'en avais qu'en transit en général. Ils arrivaient à vers minuit, 1h du matin, les trains n'étaient pas normaux du tout. Ils dormaient par terre, ils dormaient comme ils pouvaient, s'ils ne pouvaient pas autrement. Nous avons tous les deux souvent donné notre fils quand il n'y avait pas autre chose. Quand il n'y avait plus rien, plus rien. J'ai aidé simplement parce qu'ils avaient besoin d'être aidés. Cet accueil venait beaucoup de ce que les gens croyaient encore en quelque chose. Dans la Bible, il est écrit de donner à manger à celui qui a faim, de visiter celui qui est malade. C'est une chose normale.
I think this documentary moved me for a variety of reasons, but one of them, as I consider our current culture in America, I would argue that biblical hospitality would not be the maybe normal thing to do, as she said. She said, I helped simply because they needed to be helped. The Bible says to feed the hungry, to visit the sick. It was the normal thing to do. I think in our culture, it doesn't always feel normal. It feels like swimming upstream. But there is great power when we recognize that our identity as Christians means that as followers of Jesus, we are to have this radical posture of hospitality towards the stranger, towards those who are in need, towards those who are desperate for good news. And the power of hospitality is gospel work. I want to read this quote from Sky Jathani. Our homes are to be hospitals, refuges of healing, radiating the light of heaven. And our dinner tables ought to be operating tables, the place where broken souls are made whole again. In our churches, people should find rest from their battle for acceptance and release from the lie that they are nothing more than the goods they possess. When we lower our defenses, when we remove our facades and begin to be truly present with one another, then the healing power of the gospel can begin its work. May we take that scandalous love of Jesus and extend it to the world around us. May we be known as a people who have an environment of welcome, a table of grace, a space for the other, for the outsider to feel like they are a part of a greater family, and through that to experience the love of Jesus. And so let us go then show hospitality to others, to the stranger, to the immigrant, to the lonely, to the poor, even if it's a little bit messy sometimes. Because who knows? It's quite possible that we are entertaining angels unaware. Will you pray with me? Lord Jesus, it's only through your Spirit that we can even begin to have an understanding of how to even do this. And so we invite you, show us as a church to continue to grow in this way. And the ways in which we've already, part of our identity is loving and welcoming others. May we continue to grow in that on the edges and spaces. And Lord, we don't know what the future holds, but there may come a season for this church where we may even take a greater leap of faith to show hospitality to others, to welcome, to care, And in the hospitality work that's already happening through the ministries of this church, through the various local ministries in the city, to the Bay Food Pantry, to feeding souls, to the various ways in which we are participating in this work now, Lord, I pray that you would expand those ministries, that you would expand our reach for the city, all for your sake. Not because we want to put a badge of honor, but because it's what we're supposed to do. Lord, help us. Break down the walls where we feel uncertain, where we lack courage, and help us to be a hospitable people, to open our doors where there can be true healing, friendship, and people can be known and seen. Pray all these things for your beautiful name. Amen.